All right, so today we're diving into property rights.
Mhm.
And, something that I think hits close to home for a lot of us, imagine that you're living your life, you love your house.
Yeah.
And then suddenly the government's like, nope, we need that land. We're going to build something else there. See you later.
Yeah.
That's eminent domain in a nutshell. Usually it's for, highways, schools, these kind of public projects.
Yeah.
But the Kelo v. City of New London case, that one really shook things up.
Yeah, it really did.
What's so interesting about Kelo is that it was about using eminent domain
Mm-hmm.
for private development. So Suzette Kelo, her house, it wasn't like run down or anything. But the city, they wanted to give that land to Pfizer for this big redevelopment project. They were hoping to boost the economy and everything. And the Supreme Court, they basically said, yep, that's totally fine.
So essentially the government can take your home, even if there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah. And just hand it over to a corporation if they think it'll help the city. I'm guessing people were not thrilled about that.
Oh, no, they were not happy at all. The public backlash was enormous. People felt like the government was picking big businesses over regular homeowners.
Yeah, I can imagine. So what happened after that? Did states just throw up their hands and say, all right, corporations, you can take whatever land you want?
Well, not exactly. A lot of states changed their laws after Kelo, 43 to be exact. They tried to put limits on how eminent domain could be used. But here's where things get a little complicated.
Oh.
A lot of those changes weren't all that effective.
How can they change the law and not really change anything?
Well, a lot of states, they focused on the idea of blight. They said, okay, we'll only allow eminent domain for private development if the area is blighted.
Blight. That seems like a word that could mean a lot of different things.
You're exactly right. And that's kind of the problem. A lot of states define blight so broadly that it could apply to pretty much anything. Dilapidated buildings, or even just incompatible land use.
Oh, wow.
So if a city really wants a piece of property, they can usually find a way to label it as blighted, even if it's not really that bad.
So it's kind of like a loophole. They're following the letter of the law, but not the spirit of it.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And this is where we start to see how this affects certain communities more than others.
Meaning it's not just random who gets targeted by this blight loophole.
Right. Think about who has the resources to fight back against these takings. Who has lawyers and political connections. It's often not the people living in lower income neighborhoods, especially minority neighborhoods. Their properties are often cheaper and they might not have the same political clout.
That's a good point. So even with the changes, these eminent domain laws can end up hurting the people who are already struggling the most.
Yeah, it's a pattern we see over and over again, and it's especially troubling when you look back at the history of urban renewal projects in the mid-20th century. Back then, a lot of predominantly black neighborhoods, they were labeled as slums, and then they were demolished to make way for all these projects that ended up benefiting wealthier residents. Critics even called it Negro removal back then. And some people argue that the legacy of those policies is still influencing how we define and use blight today.
So it's not just about legal definitions. It's about power.
Hmm.
And who gets to decide what blight really means? What stands out to you about all of this?
You know what I find most concerning is that there's been a lot of talk about reform after Kelo. But there's still this very real danger that eminent domain could be used in ways that just make inequality worse. It reminds us that just changing the laws isn't enough. We have to look at the deeper systemic problems that make certain communities more vulnerable to these kinds of takings in the first place.
It's definitely a lot to think about. We've seen how things can go wrong, how these blight definitions can be misused to target certain communities. But I'm wondering, are there any examples of development projects that have actually benefited these communities without resorting to these kind of shady tactics?
Absolutely there are. It's not all doom and gloom. There's some great examples of developers and communities working together to create projects that are good for the economy and socially responsible too.
Okay, I'm ready for some good news.
Well, one that comes to mind is the East Baltimore Development Initiative, or EBDA for short. You've got Johns Hopkins University, this world-renowned institution right in the heart of Baltimore, but surrounding the university were some of the most disadvantaged neighborhoods in the city, dealing with poverty, crime, all sorts of issues.
So you've got this really wealthy university right next door to these struggling neighborhoods. I imagine that creates some tension.
Oh, absolutely. There was a history of conflict. The university would expand into these neighborhoods. People felt pushed out. Crime was spilling onto the campus. It wasn't a good situation for anyone.
So what did they do? Did they just try to use eminent domain to clear out those neighborhoods?
No, they did something different. They came up with this plan for a huge redevelopment project. A biotech park, new housing, retail space, the works. But the key here was that they really tried to work with the community, not against it.
So instead of just coming in and saying, we're taking over, they actually listened to the people who live there.
Exactly. They held all these community meetings, they talked to residents about their concerns, and they actually used that feedback in their plans. And they didn't just pay lip service, they made some real commitments.
Like what?
Well, for one, they offered really good relocation assistance to any residents who had to move. It wasn't just, here's what your house is worth, goodbye. They helped people find new homes. They covered rent for displaced tenants for years. And they even gave extra financial help to help people get back on their feet.
That's a big difference. It sounds like they were actually trying to help people instead of just pushing them aside.
Right, and it went beyond just relocation. EBDI wanted to make sure residents could benefit from the new development, so they created job training programs, they gave preference to local residents for construction jobs, and they worked to ensure that the new businesses would provide opportunities for people in the community.
So it was about more than just fancy new buildings. It was about creating real opportunities for the people already living there.
Exactly. And while the EBDI project is still in progress, it's seen as a good model for how to do development in a way that helps everyone, not just developers and institutions.
That's really great to hear. It sounds like they actually managed to build a bridge between the university and the community. Are there other examples like this where communities have been able to have a say and negotiate for a better outcome when it comes to development?
Yeah, for sure. Another really interesting approach is community benefits agreements, or CBAs. These are basically contracts between developers and community groups. They spell out specific benefits that the developer will provide as part of the project.
So it's like the community saying, okay, we'll support this development, but only if you agree to do these specific things.
Precisely. And these agreements can cover a lot of different things, like requirements for affordable housing, hiring preferences for local workers, even environmental protections.
It sounds like a really powerful tool for communities to have some control over what happens in their neighborhoods. Are there any examples of how these CBAs have actually worked in practice?
A really great example is the Staples Center in Los Angeles. You know where the Lakers play?
Of course.
Well, when they were planning this huge expansion, the people living in the nearby Figueroa corridor were understandably worried about getting priced out.
Makes sense.
Yeah,
Big development projects can totally change a neighborhood, driving up rents and forcing longtime residents to move.
exactly. But in this case, the community got organized. They formed a coalition called the Figueroa Corridor Coalition for Economic Justice, or FCCEJ.
They weren't just going to sit back and watch it happen.
Toop. They negotiated a CBA with the developers, and they got some really important things included. They got guarantees for local hiring so that people from the community would get those construction jobs. They got commitments for living wages for workers so that the economic benefits wouldn't just go to the top. And they secured a lot of affordable housing units as part of the development.
Wow, so they really used this CBA to shape the project
Yeah.
and make sure it benefited the existing community.
Exactly. And the Staples Center CBA is considered a landmark example of how communities can use their power to make sure that development actually works for them.
I love hearing these stories. It's easy to feel like these big development projects just steamroll over communities. But these examples show that it doesn't have to be that way.
It's true. And while these are just a couple of examples, they point to a broader trend. Communities are becoming more savvy and more assertive when it comes to development. They're demanding a seat at the table, and they're finding creative ways to ensure that development benefits everyone, not just the developers.
Yeah, it's really inspiring to see communities taking a stand and, finding ways to make development work for them. But I keep thinking about that blight loophole we talked about.
Yeah.
So long as that's still around, it feels like there's always going to be this risk that eminent domain could be used unfairly.
I think you're right. The way we define blight is a huge part of the problem. If we want to protect communities from these unfair takings, we need to be a lot more specific about what actually counts as blight. It shouldn't be this vague term that can be used to justify taking anybody's property.
So instead of saying like dilapidated buildings or incompatible land use, we should focus on whether a property is actually a threat to health or safety.
Exactly. Like, is the property dangerous to the community? Is it a public health hazard? Those are the questions we should be asking. We need to set a much higher standard for what qualifies as blight so that it can't just be used as an excuse to take property for private gain.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it seems like transparency is really important too, in those examples we talked about. At least the communities knew what was happening, and they had a chance to voice their concerns. But I imagine that's not always the case.
Unfortunately, you're right. A lot of these development deals happen behind closed doors. Without any real input from the people who are going to be most affected, we need way more transparency in this process so that communities know what's being planned and have a real chance to shape those plans.
So like more community meetings,
Yeah.
more opportunities for public input, making sure developers are really listening to residents' concerns.
Absolutely. And it's not just about listening, it's about giving communities actual power in this process. Things like community benefits agreements are a good start. But we need to go even further. Some cities are experimenting with things like community land trusts, where the community actually owns the land and has a say in how it's developed. That kind of model could really shift the balance of power.
Those are some really interesting ideas, and it makes me think about something else. We often hear about fair market value when it comes to eminent domain. But is that really enough? A home is worth so much more than just money. It's people's lives, their memories, their connections to their community.
I think that's a really important point. Just compensation needs to go beyond the market value of the property. It has to consider the social and emotional costs of displacement. Things like helping people relocate, helping them find comparable housing, even offering counseling to help people deal with the trauma of losing their homes.
Yeah, it's about recognizing the human impact of these decisions, not just treating people like numbers.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, we need to change how we think about development. Instead of seeing communities as obstacles in our way, we need to see them as partners in building a better future. We need systems that put community well-being first, not just corporate profits.
This whole deep dive started out feeling a bit heavy, but honestly, I'm feeling kind of hopeful now. The Kelo case was definitely a wake-up call. And while we still have a long way to go, it's really inspiring to see communities fighting back and demanding more equitable ways of doing development.
Yeah, I agree. The fight for just development isn't over, but there's a growing movement of people who are dedicated to making sure everyone has a chance to thrive, no matter where they live.
And that's a fight we can all be a part of. So to all our deep divers out there, next time you hear about a new development project in your area, don't just ignore it. Dig a little deeper. Ask questions. Who's going to benefit from this? Who might be displaced? Are there community benefits agreements in place? And most importantly, how can you get involved? How can you help make sure that development happens with your community, not against it?
Because ultimately, the future of our cities depends on all of us working together to create places that are just and equitable and sustainable for everyone.